Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. That siren, that pause you just heard was the siren marking the beginning of Yom Hazikaron in Israel, which Reb Mimi is going to speak to us about today. Before we get into that, just want to welcome everyone to our second session of the series From Sorrow to Joy, the Spring Holidays. This is part of ScholarStream, which is a partnership of the conservative movement, giving communities the opportunity to learn from some of the world's leading scholars and engage deeply with our texts and traditions. Today's session is titled From Sorrow to Joy, the transition from Yom Hazikaron to Yom Haatzmaut, and it'll be taught by Rabbi Dr. Reb Mimi Feigelson. She's the first ordained female Orthodox rabbi post-Shoah. She's an international teacher of Chassidut, death studies, spirituality, and a storyteller. Reb Mimi offers spiritual guidance and mentoring, specializing in death and mourning and other life transition periods. Reb Mimi formed and created, as an Israeli modern Haredi Hasidic rabbi, the role of the Mashpiah Ruhanit, spiritual mentor, in conservative rabbinical seminaries in the United States since 2001, Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, and in Yerushalayim at the Beit Midrash the Rabbanim al Shem Schechter, since her return in the summer of 2017. Prior to Los Angeles, Reb Mimi was the Associate Director of the Akar Institute for Tradition and Creativity and Director of the Women's Beit HaMidrash. She was adjunct faculty at the Ma'aleh Film College and published regularly in the Haaretz literary supplement. Reb Mimi's forthcoming book, On the Cusp of Life, From Sacred to Sacred, is an exploration and redefinition of Jewish funerals. She is the blessed and proud sole mother to over a dozen children and grandchildren. Before we get into the session, I just want to let you know how to ask questions throughout the class. You can send them to me via the chat. We won't have time to get to everyone's questions, but I'll do my best to pull together the questions and ask them to Reb Mimi. Without further ado, I will pass it off to Reb Mimi.
As Max shared with you here in Yerushalayim, welcome to my home in Yerushalayim, welcome to my study. This is where I spend a lot of my time. And oops, I apologize for that. Sometimes when I move my laptop, the camera, it takes a moment of its own. So it'll come back in a moment. I ask your forgiveness. I forgot. There we are. And I can't move it. So we're good. And for those who've learned together, I know that we always start with an opening nigun and an opening prayer. And I want to start today with the words that we'll be singing are actually from Echa, from Lamentations. Nachamu, nachamu ami. Yomar Hashem Elokechem, be consoled, my people. Nachamu, nachamu ami. Yomar Hashem Elokechem, Hashem your God will say. Dabru alev Yerushalayim, speak upon the heart of Jerusalem. V'kir'u eleh, and call to her. And I want to say two things about this verse. One is the fact that the word nachamu appears twice. Nachamu, nachamu ami. Be consoled, my people. But I also feel, I learned this from my teacher, Reb Shlomo Carlebach. He said, why does it say nachamu twice? Because the words of consolation need to be words of consolation. Many times when we share something harsh or hard, and someone will say, yes, let me tell you a story. I heard something, even a worse story. Right? That's not consoling. That's not comforting. To know that someone else suffered more than me, that is not a comfort. So when the prophet says, when Yirmiyahu says, nachamu, nachamu ami, be consoled, my people, the gift is to be able to console each other with words of consolation. And the other is that the second half of the pasuk says, Dabru alev Yerushalayim, speak upon the heart of Jerusalem and call out to her. V'kir'u eleh. And sometimes the feeling is that the consolation is close. Speak to her on your heart. Sometimes v'kir'u eleh, call out to her. Sometimes it feels far. And in our tradition here in Israel, to bring Yom Hazikaron and Yom Haatzmaut together so close, it's a way of reminding us that the consolation is close. The consolation is close. We need to sit in our sorrow. We need to sit in our loss. We need to sit in our longing. And at the same time, the comfort, the consolation is close. So I've learned, I want to say, I've become an expert at lip reading since Corona has begun. Now, I've been teaching on Zoom before Corona as well, but especially since Corona, when so much is happening on Zoom, I've become an expert at lip reading. Because when we sing, I can't hear you sing, but I can see if your lips are moving or not. So even if you don't know the words, right, you can be humming. I see the lips. So really, I'm inviting us all, right? We can all lip read each other's lips as we sing together. Nachamu, nachamu, ami, Yom Ha'elokechem. 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 Todamu alei Yerushalayim, v'kiru eila. Todamu alei Yerushalayim, v'kiru eila. Hamana Malka de Alma, one and only Divine Mother, Spirit of all, Source of all. Thank you for this gift of sitting together and learning Torah. Thank you for knowing that there's something that everything and anything that God has an ability to bring us together. The Torah has the ability and the gift to bring us together. And wherever it is that we are in the world, we know that when we are in a moment of sorrow or in a moment of joy, the one thing we can always share is a word of Torah, and that will give us strength to take the next step, even at times when that next step is not so clear and not so obvious. And for me, I want to say here in Jerusalem, as I was driving home, I went to see my mom, my Ima, and who, God willing, is here and joining us as well, even though her screen is closed. So I also, in her presence, asked her permission to be sharing the words of Torah. And as I was driving home from having dinner together a few minutes ago, people were actually gathering for small local ceremonies, memorial ceremonies. In Israel, really, life stops for the next 24 hours. Even when it's not Corona, restaurants are closed, movies are closed, everything shuts down for 24 hours. And the country really goes into a deep sense of mourning and of support. And I want to share two things before we actually go into our sources that I prepared for today. One which I received actually yesterday when teaching at Schechter. So I'm the spiritual mentor of the Rabbinical School, the Rabbinical Seminary at Schechter. And at the same time, I also am a lecturer at the Schechter Institutes. So I have multiple hats. And when teaching yesterday a course that I'm giving now on new approaches to death, funerals, and cemeteries and mourning, one of my students, her husband was killed 20 years ago in a terrorist attack. And I asked her to share some words in the beginning of class, which she did, and words that were connected to the learning that we've been doing over the last 4 weeks since the beginning of the semester. And at the end of her words, she said, and our children will be gathering together and tomorrow, and in a few months we'll be commemorating 20 years, and we're looking for a way to uniquely commemorate the 20th year. So if any of you have an idea, please be in touch with me. And there was something, so I want to say, so Israeli about sharing an opening comment in an MA course in Yerushalayim, and the class being asked to think also of a way to commemorate the husband of one of the classmates, and that was a gift. And the other thing I want to share with you is something that it's a small book. It's called Lichyot et HaNetzach, to live eternity, and you won't find it in any store. So don't look for it. I'm going to save you that. And that's actually why I want to share a moment from this book with you. And I think there are actually very few people, I must say, few people in the world that are going to have this opportunity. Lichyot et HaNetzach is a memorial book that was put out after I hope you can see his picture. Benny Gal, he was 18 when he was killed in the Yom Kippur War, 1973. His mother was my teacher in 6th grade. And he was killed on the first day of the Yom Kippur War in the Suez Canal, which meant that he was considered missing for months until there was a ceasefire. And I was actually in class in 6th grade the day that Mrs. Gall was called out of class. And she came back in a few minutes later and she said, "You all have to go into the other class now. I need to leave." And one of the students, Ruhanit, I'll never forget, you know, the one that never has a problem asking questions, says, "Why?" And Mrs. Gall said, "They found my son." And I remember when I went to Shiv'ah, it's the only time I've seen what I've saw in such a stark way. You know, when you go to a house of mourning, the tradition is that the mourner is the one who opens the conversation. And until the mourner doesn't start speaking, we're meant to be there to be with them in the way they need us to be with them. And we're meant to wait until they open in words, and then to share words with them based on what it is that they're asking for. And I remember I was 11 in 12th grade, and I was 11 in 6th grade, and it was the first time actually that I went to a shiva home, and I went actually by myself, and I walked in, and there was silence. No one spoke. There was nothing to say, and nothing that they wanted to hear. No one spoke. And we sat there in complete silence, sat there for a long while. And then I got up. I said a traditional blessing for comfort that we offer. And then I walked out. And that's a shiva that I will never forget, that silence, that silence. And because our topic is from joy to sorrow, I want to say one more thing. And before that, so I wanted to share a word from this book, from this teaching, from this book. And Benny, as I said, he was 18 when he was killed, and he was one of the yeshiva students that went down to the Suez Canal to be with the different groups of soldiers to lead the tefillot, to be a shaliach tzibur, to be the chazan for Yom Kippur, and that's what happened. And so then he had a girlfriend, Karen, that was American, and they would correspond. And they met here in Israel, and then she went back to the States. And so in the book are some of his correspondence. And one of the things that he writes to her is, he says, when you're lonely for Israel, when you miss Israel, go to shul. Go to shul. Go to the Bet Knesset. Go to the synagogue. Because the land that the synagogue is connected to, if you go down deep, 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 deep into Mother Earth, you'll come out in Israel on the other side. So wherever your synagogue is, if you walk in and you stand in your synagogue for a moment, you'll be connecting yourself back to Israel. And I didn't know this about his writings until actually after being in Los Angeles for many years when I was teaching at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles and the spiritual mentor, the Mashpiah Ruhanit of the school. And I miss my students and I miss my colleagues so much. And some days at the end of the day of teaching, I'd feel lost and I would miss home. I'd miss Yerushalayim so much. And my instinct told me, just go to shul for Mincha Maariv. Just go. Go to B'nai David, go to shul for Mincha Maariv. And in the first a while when I would do that, I would walk in and Mr. Sassover, who was a Holocaust survivor, and then he fought in the Independence War and got to give him and his wife long life and longevity and good health. And when I first would walk in, he'd go, whose yahrzeit is it? And I'd say, Mr. Sassover, does a person need a yahrzeit to come to Mincha Maariv? Right? Do I need a yahrzeit? But it went on for a while, and he'd say, whose yahrzeit is it? And then finally, thank God, he got it. That when Mimi comes to daven Mincha Maariv, sometimes it's a yahrzeit. Yeah, sometimes it's some Hasidic master that I have to say yahrzeit. Sometimes, it's a family member or a soul child or a soul sibling. And sometimes it's because I'm lonely. I'm longing for Yerushalayim. And the best way for me to overcome that longing, speak to her and call out to her. The best way for me to do that in Los Angeles was to go to synagogue, to go to Mincha Maariv. And my other trick was I'd go to the sea, I'd go to the ocean. Why? I put my feet in the water of the ocean of Los Angeles, the Pacific, yes? And I'd say to myself, the water that I'm standing in is touching the shore of Tel Aviv. Because the waters are connected. Right? It's our choice. I want to say also for this question of joy and sorrow, these are the choices that we can also make in terms of how we live the connections of our life. Now, someone could say, Mimi, that is ridiculous. You're standing in Venice Beach. You're nowhere near. There's an ocean and a continent between you and home. And I would say, believe me, I know that. And at the same time, the waters that I'm standing in are connected to the waters of the Tel Aviv beach that I know, the Palmachim beach that I know, the Rishon LeZion beach that I know. I'm home. I'm home. So I invite you also to, our mind is a magician. Our mind is a magician in terms of what we can do and the worlds that we can create with our mind and in our thinking. And in those moments, and then only years later, I found out as reading this, as preparing actually for a class at Ziegler that I wanted to share with my students, right? That I found that teaching of his about when you're lonely, when you're not in Israel, go into the synagogue and you'll find yourself standing on earth, on land that is connected. So, that being said, I want to share with you a couple of sources, and the source sheet is now up on in your chat. And I am not going to share it on the screen because, for me, honestly, there's so much separateness and so much seclusion that I feel actually it's a gift to be able to see each other, and that each one of you can download the sources. I want to say something about the source and something about what we're going to do. The sources are all in Hebrew. Do not be scared. I will be reading out loud in Hebrew and translating everything into English. I promise. So no one will get lost. It's really important for me for you to have sources in Hebrew because I truly and honestly believe with every part of my being that our soul never forgets what our eyes see. Our soul never forgets what our eyes see. And we have ways of feeding ourselves consciously, and we have ways of feeding ourselves subconsciously. So when your eyes glance on these pages of sources and you're saying, what am I doing here? And I don't read Hebrew and I don't understand Hebrew. So think of it as a way of feeding your subconscious. And then you're going to have to trust my translation. So, and I promise to be as close as I can to be the translation. And this is a way also of saying, of overcoming limitations, because we're going to look at a teaching of a Hasidic master who lived in the first half of the 19th century, the Radomsko Rebbe, Reb Shlomo of Radomsk. As you can see, he lived from 1800 to 1866. And he was a Kohen. When he had guests, the Maimonides, the Rambam says the most important part of having guests, receiving guests, is actually escorting them. And is told that he would actually escort his guests to the porch of his home. And as they were walking away, he would stand there with his hands as in the priestly position. And he would stand there like that until his guests were out of sight. And my students, they used to make fun of me a lot because I'd walk them to the door and then I'd stand there on the door and I'd wait until they were out of sight. And they're like, why are you standing there? And sometimes I'd walk them to the corner and then stand on the corner until they were out of sight. And I'd say, because I'm a student of the Radomsko Rebbe, and this is what he would do, and this is what I would do. Except for one student that I found out that it makes him very uncomfortable. Says, what's the problem with her? Like, can't you just let go? It's like the claws of a mother. No release, just let go. I walked out your door, let me go. So with that student, I've learned that when he leaves, I wait for a moment and then I close the door and give him the freedom. Okay, so I'm going to read some, I'm going to translate some, I'm going to explain some, I'm going to walk us through a process some, and I will pause. I'll pause for questions. Max is going to help us here with the questions. I'll pause for questions, and then again towards the end, I'll pause for questions again. And also you should know that on my source sheet, there are a few things in English, the titles in English, and also my email address. So also feel free if there are questions that come up that we haven't addressed and I can respond to them later, that also you have my email. In 20 years from now, if you have a question, you have my email. So don't be shy. And know that we've shared this moment together, and now we're bound and connected, and you know where to find me and how to find me. I still use my Hotmail account for that reason as well. From 1985, I still use my Hotmail account so people can continuously find me. Okay, I brought a teaching. Let me tell you what you have in front of you. I brought a teaching from the Dumsker Rebbe on Purim. Now, why Purim? You could say, okay, we just finished Pesach, and Purim is like the furthest holiday again, except for Pesach, right? But Purim has within it this transition from joy, from suffering to joy, from a decree to salvation, right? It's there. One night the king can't sleep. Just want to remind you the story. I know we've had a lot of Pesach stories between Purim and now. I just want to remind you for a moment the Purim story. Like there's a transitional moment, right, when the king can't sleep, Achashverosh can't sleep, and he says, "Bring out the books, the history books, the story books, the chronicles. Read to me, right? Before radio, before podcast, before read to me." And the story of how Mordechai saved him. He says, "Oh, what's happened?" And was he rewarded? And that's when Haman is in the courtyard, and he calls him. And there's this whole shift in the story that happens. Mordechai all of a sudden goes from wearing sackcloth to masquerading in the city of Shushan, all dressed up in royalty. There's a story that happens in the story of Esther, in the book of Esther, that happens that's connected to the garments. I want you to kind of like dig back in your memory for a moment about, there's a lot of conversation about clothing. Mordechai hears what happens, and he goes and sits, he rents his clothes, and he's in sackcloth, and he's sitting at the outside of the gate of the king. Esther's inside. She sends him garments. He doesn't want them. He sends them back to her and he's saying, we're in mourning now. There is a decree. And she says, I hear you. Fast for 3 days with me, then I'll go into the king. She dresses herself in royalty. She approaches the king. The meal happens. In the meantime, Haman dresses Mordechai up in the garments of the king, masquerades through the town. The masquerade is over. Mordechai goes back to the gate, doesn't go back to the sackcloth, but goes back to the gate. And the next thing we know, Mordechai himself walks out from in front of the king in royal garments. Now the Talmud, I want you to know, is there's an ongoing question about Esther, and that is God's name doesn't appear in the book of Esther. How can that be that God's book, there's a book in the Bible, there's a book in the Tanakh that does not have God's name? And for some of the sages of the Talmud, that's an impossible situation. So what they say is, one of the sages, Rabbi Tanchum says, actually, every time the Megillah, the scroll says Hamelech, the king, and doesn't say the king Achashverosh, the king is God. When it wants to say King Achashverosh, it says King Achashverosh. But when the Megillah says, when the scroll says, the book of Esther says only the king, it's God, which is a way of bringing God into the story. So when it says, Mordechai came out from before the king, dressed in royalty. So according to that opinion, from being in God's presence. So the Radomsker Rebbe, I want you to see on the source sheet. I'm really here in the top, and it's bold letters, and it's a quote from the verse of the book of Esther itself. ישלח בגדים להלביש את מרדכי ולהסיר שקו מעליו ולא קיבל. Sends him clothing to dress Mordechai, להלביש את Mordechai, to dress him, to clothe him, ולהסיר שקו, and to remove his sackcloth from him, and he did not accept. And I want to say there's a double process here. One is to remove the sackcloth, and the other is to dress him in royalty. Now this double process, for me, I feel, is based on a teaching from the Talmud in the tractate of Brachot. It talks about how when a person enters into a place of prayer, a person should always enter 2 entrances and then pray, as if to say there's a courtyard and a foyer, right? Why is that so? So that we're actually on the inside when we start praying. It's a way of removing ourselves. The first step is we're off the street, And the second is we're entering into prayer. Like we say, Sur mera v'asetov, Sur mera v'asetov, Bakesh shalom ve'rodfehu. We sing Mia Yesh Chafetz Chaim. One is Sur mera, one is to remove the darkness. The other is v'asetov, is to do good. Right? One is to remove dark is not enough. I want to say to remove the sorrow is not enough. That's to relieve the pain. But relieving the pain is only one part in the process of the healing. We need to remove the pain and we need to promote healing. Sur mera, we need to divert from the evil. Va'aseto, we need to promote the good. She wants to remove his sackcloth and dress him in royal garments. And he sends them back, not accepting them. And I want to say there's sign language happening here. There's an ongoing conversation through the garments. Now, only if you really know someone can you actually understand their metaphoric language. Because Mordechai doesn't need her clothes. He intentionally ripped them. And he could put on new clothes. He doesn't need her clothes. But when she sends him the clothes, the Radomsko Rebbe says, she's saying to him, I know there are two ways of serving God. One is is fear and trepidation. One is love. One is mourning, and one is celebration. You are sitting in mourning, and transformation is not going to happen while you sit in mourning. Because the Talmud teaches us that the only way to come in front of the King of Kings, the Queen of Queens, is in joy. Oz v'chedva bimkomo, joy and glory is in his place. The way Esther says to Mordechai, I'm sending you the royal garments because I want you to see that sitting in sackcloth is not the way to make your way in. You can sit at the gate of the king, Sha'ar HaMelech, but if you want to enter in to the courtyard, for that, you need to hold yourself differently. There has to be joy. There has to be celebration. And when he sends her the clothing back, he's saying to her, not now. Not now. This is not the time for celebration. Okay, I'm gonna move into an irreverent moment for a moment, and you'll forgive me, but you'll come with me, I hope. And I know I'm dating myself, and I think I can share this memory with many that I see in front of me on my screen. And that is, I always joke and I say that if I was asked, and I wasn't asked, but if I was asked, what book would I like to add to the 24 books of the Tanakh? It would be the script of The Sound of Music. I think every sentence there is holy. I really do. There's a lesson in every sentence. So the one I'm specifically thinking about right now is when they are hiding from the Nazi soldiers in the cemetery in the church, right? And the little one, she wants to sing because she knows when I'm small, right? This is the things I do when I'm feeling sad, right? And Maria says to her, not right now. Not right now. So I feel that Mordechai is sending back the garments to Esther saying, not right now. I understand royal garments. I understand royalty as a way of entering into. I understand celebration as a way, but not now. And Esther's response is to say, fast for me 3 days and then I'll go into the king. When Mordechai sends the garments back, she understands what he's saying. If you don't understand them, you don't understand what's happening. If they have a sign language, they have a way to communicate between them. If we don't understand that, then we think that why is the book of Esther spending so much time on these garments and sending them back and forth? Unless it's a code. It's a code between them. It's a family code. Esther receives the garments that Mordechai rejects, and she says, I understand. Okay. But the only way in is with joy. But before that, fast 3 days. I hear you, Mordechai. I'll take on the fasting for 3 days. And then I'll dress myself. But Tilbash Esther Malachut. She takes it upon herself to dress herself in royalty. And then goes in to speak with the king. I'm going to pause here for a moment. If there are questions or thoughts that you would like to share. Okay, there's a reminder to send the questions to Max. If there are questions, if there are thoughts, something in your mind, something about the way you negotiate this sorrow and joy, this conversation. Have you used your garments, your clothing, your wardrobe? I want to share with you. It really came to my memory. Yes.
We have one question from Julian
Please.
Udelson, or it's more of a comment. He says, when Aaron explained when he did not eat at the sacrifice, Moses understood.
Yes. There's a conversation, right? And I want to say there's an intimacy in these families of how they communicate, which again, I want to say in last week's Torah portion, when Aharon is silent, right? How do we understand silence? Is silence respect? Is silence honor? Is silence indifference? For example, respect or indifference? Is silence arrogant or shy? If we know the person, then we understand where their silence is coming from. Right? We know how to read them. We know how to read them. There are other thoughts, other comments? Okay. So the memory that I had is about garments and about mourning is when my father crossed over, and that's the word I use for death and dying, crossed over. And for me, there's a continuum of life, as a spectrum of body and soul, and the proportions between body and soul is how different people think about different states of being and existence. So therefore, I use the phrase cross over. And one of my dear traditions is actually, I know that when people are in their last moments, we have a tradition of saying vidui, a confession prayer. I also have a tradition of saying tfilat haderech with the person, their prayer for the journey, because their soul is going on a journey as it departs. So I also say tfilat haderech. And when my father crossed over 30 years ago, I was 24 at the time, and I wore the shirt that I did my kriya on. I wore a black blouse. I wore that shirt the whole 30 days. And my father was buried on Tu B'Shvat, which meant that we got up from our shloshim was over, our 30 days was over, it was Purim. Now, you come out of the Tanit Esther, the fast of Esther, straight into Purim, you don't change your clothes. So the fast of Esther, the 13th, was still part of Shloshim, but Purim was already, the 14th was already not. But I was still wearing my clothes because I didn't change in between. And we went to the Megillah reading actually at my rabbi's home. And his wife, Noah, bless her, I never forgot this. We walked in because it was going to be a quiet Megillah reading, and that was appropriate at the time. And she walked over, she greeted me, and what she did is she touched the lapel of my blouse, of my black blouse that was with the rip. She touched it and she said, enough. Enough. That's all she said. Nothing more. And enough. Enough. And last year in Pesach, before Pesach, I called to say Chag Sameach, and I reminded her of that moment. And she said, and and I was thinking last week that I came home one day and I was looking at the tree in the yard, and I remembered how once we came home and found you davening mincha in the yard because we weren't home and you were waiting for us. And these are the memories that we hold of each other.
One last note on clothing is Michael Troner notes that clothing also plays a huge role in the Joseph story.
And the Joseph story, of course. Clothing, right? I want to say, when is the first costume, dear friends? When is the first costume that we encounter in our tradition? Okay, if you can open, if it's permissible to open your mic, so just open your mic. When is the Gan Eden? Thank you. Okay, I want to say, Jan, Gan Eden. I want to say even before Gan Eden. Okay, because you're right. Because right, Adam and Eve, they dress. We could say even before they, right, one is like their bodies are their costume for their soul. I want to say the planet, the earth, the world is God's costume. This is how God dresses up. So, and in the Hebrew language, right, the word, we have multiple words for clothing, garments, in English as well, garments, clothing. We have the word beged, begadim, like in this pasuk, tishlach begadim. But beged is also connected to the word begida, betrayal. Right? And how do we at times use our garments to hide something? In both directions. Right? We use it sometimes to hide our joy. We use it sometimes to hide our sadness. We use it sometimes to actually convey a message. So begadim and begida, and you see, tishlach begadim lehalbish. Another word for garment is levush. Levush, garment, is also connected to the word busha, shame. Shame. And again, sometimes we use our garments in a way that lift us up. Sometimes when we're dressed, sometimes we're overdressed in the wrong place and we're embarrassed. Sometimes we're underdressed in the wrong place and we're also embarrassed. Right? A dress code. It's like, oops, right? You dress up and it's like everyone is there in their sweats. And like, oh my God, this is totally wrong. Oh, and the flip happens as well. So levush and busha. I want to say one more word, and that's tachposet, a costume. Tachposet. I hope you can hear the word here. Lechapes, to seek. To seek. Tachposet, costume. Lechapes, to seek. And sometimes we dress ourselves up in a costume because there's something in our life that we're seeking. Right? Sometimes our costume is how we dress to go to work. Sometimes our costume is how we undress in an intimate relationship, right? And we use our birthday costume. We have multiple ways of using our garments and right? And those who, I want to say, when I worked at Yakar here in Yerushalayim many years ago, and today's a Tuesday, and I actually remember the moment. It was a Tuesday, and I walked in on a Tuesday. I was dressed for Shabbat. I had a big red and black hat on, and I was dressed in red and black clothes. I was like, and big earrings, and everyone was like, "Wow, you look amazing!" And Joni, who was the office administrator, she looks at me and she says, "Mimi, what's wrong? Mimi, what's wrong?" And I hugged her, and I wanted to kiss her because I knew she was the only one who understood that I was in a costume that day. And I was dressing up so people wouldn't see actually how upset I was. That's the truth. That's the truth. So the words that we use and the dialogue that we use. So I want to come back to our story, and I want to hold us in this moment that we are here in Israel, like we're really in Yom Hazikaron, and we move to Yom Haatzmaut. And in Israel, it's really important that these 2 days are together. I know that in the States, they're not wed Memorial Day, right, or Memorial Day weekend, and Independence Day, they're not wed. I mean, I remember for the years I spent in LA, that they're not connected. And here in Israel, it's very important to see the relationship between the two, right? There's a reason why our Torah scroll, they're called Atzei Chaim, right? The poles upon which the Torah scroll is scrolled is called the trees of life, Atzei Chaim. And there are 2 poles. We have a Megillah, right? The Megillah, the book, we say in English, the book of Esther, but the scroll of Esther, right, is a scroll. It doesn't have not even one. Sometimes it's evolved around one pole. But our Torah, our Sefer Torah, has 2 poles, 2 trees of life. And one is a Mordechai, and one is an Esther. And they are connected. Our Sefer Torah is connected. And the 2 poles are connected by the stories that we tell, and by the stories that we share, and by the narrative that holds them together. And I want to say I feel, there are some people that have this gift of when they lift the Torah Shabbat morning or Mondays and Thursdays, and where everyone sings V'zot HaBracha, that that there's a tradition to open it up to see 6 columns. I don't know if you've ever seen this. And people that open 6 columns. And there's a way in which I feel it's a little bit not modest. It's like the queen. It's like, it's just a little not modest. Like the Sefer Torah needs to be a little covered, a little concealed, right? And if you notice, in between the aliyot on Shabbat morning, we put the garment, the dress, a Sefer Torah as a dress, as a simla, as a mantle, right? We cover the Sefer Torah as the blessings are being said. And even when the person is called up to the Torah, we see where it is. We're meant to, right? We kiss that place, right? And then we close it and say the blessings. It's like not to keep her too open, not to keep her too exposed. There's a modesty there as well. So how connected? And so I want to say that this tradition that we have here in Israel, to have the 2 days to connect it, is like to keep these 2 poles close. I want to say our tradition is very meticulous in terms of laws of mourning. The Talmud says, Shlosha yamim labechi, 3 days for crying, 7 days for mourning. Then we have 30 days. We have 11 and 12 months. And then 1 day a year. And like Rabbanit Noah said to me, Dai, enough. Now that doesn't mean that we don't have those feelings and they don't live with us and continue with us. It doesn't mean I don't miss my father every day. I'm grateful to be wearing some of his jewelry on my hand every day. Right? It doesn't mean that. But we're asked to hold, to contain. On the one hand, also to support ourselves and to support, and for community to support us, but for us also to support the community. What is appropriate? What is not appropriate? Prolonged loss, prolonged mourning. Right? These are all issues, and I know I'm throwing a lot in your direction and a lot to hold on to. But here in Israel, we've decided, we've decided that Yom Hazikaron and Yom Haatzmaut come together. Esther, she fasted for 3 days. We now, Tanit Esther, the fast of Esther is only 1 day. Right? How long do we sit between this acknowledgement of of the deaths and the acknowledgement of all the 23,900 soldiers and civilians, Yes? And how do we make sure, I always say, I want to say, when I call people, that if I can't pay a shiva call, I'm not crazy about this phrase, pay a shiva call, but a lot of things we'll see in our tradition, actually, the word damim, blood, also means the word money. It's the same word, damim, in Hebrew, right? Same currency. So to pay a shiva call, if I can't go there in person, then often the time I call is the next day, is the day after shiva, because everyone disappears. Everyone promises they're going to come back. And the nature of the human condition is most of us disappear. Not everyone, not always, more often than not. So the next day is the hard day. And for us, the next day is Yom Haatzmaut, is the Independence Day. And what's become very common in Israel, which wasn't 25 years ago, but has become more and more common, are transition ceremonies. Communities will not have necessarily a ceremony tonight, Yom Hazikaron, and will stay glued to the communal ceremonies that happen together, like we're all glued to our screens. But transition ceremonies, in the last hour of Yom Hazikaron, entering into the festival and the festivities of the prayers of Hallel of Yom Haatzmaut. Because really, the transition time is actually the hardest. And I remember hearing this from my teacher, Reb Shlomo, and after that, I'll pause for a moment. And again, if there are questions. He said the homeless were most lonely. I want to say the time that we light Hanukkah candles, from the time that the sun begins to set until there are no more people in the market. He said, and that's the time that the Gemara teaches us, the Talmud teaches us when we light candles. From the sunset until there are no more people walking in the market. And the homeless, like on the Upper West Side that he was very close with, they would share with him that the time that they were most lonely was exactly that time. So during the day, they had their routine and they were fine. And at night, they had their place to be and they were settled in. But that hour or so when everyone was running home and they didn't have a home to run home to, that was the hard time. And I feel that this creation of these transitional ceremonies that we now have become more and more common here in Israel, of the last hour of Yom Hazikaron that leads us into the Hallel prayers of Mariv, Arvit, of Yom Haatzmaut, of Independence Day, that's the hardest time, right? And this is the time that we're actually helping. I want to say helping those who are in mourning to transition into. I also want to say those of us who have survivor's guilt, right? Also, it's a way of being in community and helping us transition into the celebration. It's a way of saying, die, enough. Mordechai sends back the clothes. Esther receives them. She says, understands it's not a time for celebration. Fast for 3 days. She rests herself in royalty, goes into the king. We contain, quarantine, define our sorrow, and then own and honor and transition into celebration. And the Talmud tells us and teaches us that it is true that God accepts our prayers in every possible way. There's a celebration that comes from within the sorrow, and that's different from a celebration that doesn't take the sorrow into consideration. Right? And we're seeking for a full celebration. And that celebration is one that also honors the sorrow that leads to the ability to then transition into the celebration. I'm going to pause here if there are questions, comments, thoughts. And Nelson, I want to ask you to email me and we'll find a time to talk. Please. I don't know if Nelson is a first name or last name. I can't see. Please be in touch. Yes.
So we just have one comment here noting that the Shoresh of Esther is Seter.
Yes. Yes, thank you. And Megillat Esther is translated in English to the book of Esther, but it's not Sefer Esther, it's Megillah. Now, Megillah means scroll, but Megillah is also connected to the word legalot, to reveal. Megillat Esther is revealing the concealed. And I want us to also understand that people sometimes don't understand celebration. Sometimes people don't understand that what they're seeing is not frivolous, but there's so much work, so much soul work that went into that person getting up and dancing, that person getting up and singing, right? That person getting up and embracing life and embracing living. That is the challenge. And I want to say for some people, and I do also want to say for some people, it was very abrupt. The transition from Yom Hazikaron to Yom Haatzmaut is abrupt for some. I think that that's why also honoring these transitional celebrations, prayers and stories are crucial and helpful. It's similar to Kabbalat Shabbat. We need that time between the 6 days of the week to enter into Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat is the one door. When Talmud says we need both doors in order to enter, like how do we enter into Shabbat? There are two doors we enter into Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat and Arvit and Mariv. Right? And Kabbalat Shabbat, there are 6 Psalms that lead us to Lecha Dodi. 6 Psalms, one for each day of the week. When we say the first Psalm of Kabbalat Shabbat, we look at Sunday. When we say the second Psalm, we have an opportunity to say hello and goodbye to Monday, and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So when we come to the Chadodi, we're greeting the Queen. And then Mizmor Shir L'Yom HaShabbat, we're in Shabbat. And then we can say Arvit. And I want to say this is a challenge for all of us, and this is an invitation for all of us. How do we honor the sorrow? That's Yom Hazikaron. How do we honor the celebration? Because we do have a state. Far from perfect, far from a lot of things, as we all know. And yet we have an obligation. I want to say we have an obligation to Yom Hazikaron. We have an obligation to Yom Haatzmaut. We have an obligation to honor our Memorial Day, our Yom Hazikaron. We have an obligation to celebrate our Yom Haatzmaut, whether on a national level or this is also a lesson on a personal level in our own lives.
Thank you so much, Beb Mimi, for teaching us today. Thanks everyone for joining. We will not be meeting next week since there are no holidays next week, but the series will pick up again in 2 weeks, April 27th. Rabbi Professor David Galinkin, president of the Schechter Institute, will be teaching on why do we celebrate Lag BaOmer and how. So we will see you then.
I want to close with a closing prayer, if I may. One and only, thank you for this time. Thank you for holding me in both of my worlds, in both of my communities simultaneously, allowing me to be in my day of memorial already with those who I love so much on both sides of the world, my 2 Atzei Chaim, my 2 trees of life. And may we find ways to continue to find ways to share Torah together, to be with each other in times of mourning and to be with each other in moments of celebration.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.